The mountains around Willow Creek were old and quiet, a world of deep green pine forests and rocky ridges that cut into the sky. People in the small town below knew the stories. They spoke of a wolf, a big one with a coat like winter smoke, who was more ghost than animal. He had been seen, but never caught, never even clearly photographed. He was the last of his pack, and he wanted nothing to do with humans. He was a creature of perfect silence. When the wildlife rangers came with their tranquilizer darts and tracking collars, hoping to study him, he would melt into the shadows. He understood the click of a camera lens and the scent of metal. When poachers set their cruel, steel-jawed traps, he would circle them, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. He'd even been known to trigger them from a distance with a thrown branch. The wolf learned the smell of anger, of greed, and of simple curiosity. To him, they were all the same danger. His world was the high country, and his only rule was to be alone. Down where the mountains met the first fields, life was quieter for a little girl who had just arrived. She had come to live with her grandfather in his worn wooden cabin. The town was too still, the silence in the house too loud. She missed the sound of her mother's voice terribly. The other children at the school bus stop were strangers, and their games felt like a language she'd forgotten. Her grandfather was kind, with gentle hands and a love for the woods, but a heavy sadness hung between them, a loss they couldn't quite talk about. The girl found her comfort outside. Her grandfather taught her the names of trees, the sturdy oak, the whispering aspen. He showed her how to look for the story's animals left behind, the delicate hoof print of a deer, the frantic scratch marks of a squirrel digging for a nut. She started carrying a small sketchbook with her, its pages filling with careful drawings of birds, beetles, and flowers. She was trying to make sense of this new, quiet world by paying close attention to it. That one evening, as her grandfather stoked the fire, he told her about the wolf. "They call him Ghost," he said, his voice low. "Folks say he's smarter than any man in these woods. Lost his whole family over the years. Now he trusts no one. He's a reminder of the wild that's slipping away." The girl listened, her eyes wide. She didn't see a ghost or a legend. She pictured an animal that was lonely, just like her. She started looking for him, not to find him, but just to look. She'd scan the distant ridges, hoping for a glimpse of moving silver. The wolf, for his part, was aware of the new presence at the forest's edge. From his high lookout, he could see the small figure moving through the lower meadows. This human gave off no scent of excitement or danger. She moved slowly, stopping often to kneel and look at things he would never notice: a bright rock, a fallen feather. She was a puzzle. He watched her the way he watched everything, with caution, but also a flicker of something unfamiliar. She was so small, and she was always alone. One day, the wolf's careful life was shattered. A rival pack, moving into his territory, cornered him near a stream. The fight was a blur of snarls and teeth. He drove them off, protecting his land, but not without a price. A deep, vicious bite tore into his flank. It hurt, a burning pain that made his legs stiff. He limped to a hidden den he knew, a shallow cave behind a waterfall, and licked the wound clean. But infection, he did not understand. As days passed, a fever set in. The wound grew hot and angry, oozing. His head felt thick, and the world swam when he tried to stand. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but he was too weak to hunt properly. The girl felt a change in the air. The birdsong from the usual thicket was silent. A stillness, heavy and wrong, had settled over one part of the woods. Driven by a worry she couldn't explain, she followed a deer trail further up the mountain than she had ever gone before. The trees grew thicker, the light turning green and gold. And then she heard it, a low, pained sound, like a sigh of wind through a crack. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She peeked around the trunk of a giant ancient pine. There he was, the wolf from her grandfather's stories. He was even bigger up close, his fur matted with dirt and dry blood around a wound that looked terrible. He was lying on his side, panting. His golden eyes, cloudy with pain, opened and locked directly onto hers. A jolt of pure fear shot through her. Every story, every warning, screamed in her head to run. The wolf's lips twitched back, showing just a hint of white teeth. A weak, rumbling growl came from his chest. It wasn't the fierce challenge of a hunter. It was the desperate warning of a creature who believed he was about to die. The little girl stood frozen. She saw the fear in his eyes, which mirrored her own. She saw the proud head trying to lift and failing. She didn't see a monster. She saw a hurt and lonely animal, just like the injured fox kit her grandfather had helped last spring out very, very slowly. She sank to her knees. She made herself small and still. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you." She kept talking, a soft stream of words about the sunny day, about the squirrels she'd seen earlier, about anything that came to mind. She didn't move closer. She just sat and waited and watched the great wolf watch her, the growl slowly dying in his throat as the strange, gentle sound of her voice filled the quiet space between them. The sun was beginning to dip behind the ridges, painting the sky in colors of orange and purple. The little girl knew she had to get home before her grandfather worried, but leaving the wolf felt like a betrayal. His eyes, still watching her, were no longer filled with that sharp warning, but with a deep, exhausted confusion. "I have to go," she whispered to him, her voice barely louder than the rustle of the leaves. "But I'll come back. I'll bring help." She said the last part more to herself than to him. Who could she bring? The rangers might just put him in a cage, or worse, if they thought he was too dangerous. The men in town with their trucks and loud voices? Never. This was a secret. A fragile, trembling secret between her and the wolf. She stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. The wolf's head lifted a fraction, tracking her. She took a step back, then another. "I promise," she said again, and then she turned and walked away, feeling his gaze on her back, until the trees hid him from view. The walk home felt longer. Her mind was racing. Her grandfather's stew was simmering on the old wood stove when she walked in, filling the cabin with a warm, meaty smell. "You're late." "Sweetheart," her grandfather said, his kind eyes crinkling with concern. "Find something interesting out there?" "Just walking," she said, hanging her jacket by the door. She sat at the worn kitchen table. The image of the wolf's wound burned into her mind. It was bad. It needed cleaning. It needed medicine. As her grandfather ladled stew into bowls, she had an idea. "Grandpa," she began, trying to sound casual, "remember that fox, the one with the hurt leg last spring? What was that plant you used? The smelly green paste?" Her grandfather smiled, sitting down. "Comfrey. Good memory. And yarrow for cleaning. Made a poultice. Nature's own pharmacy right there in the meadow." He launched into the story, and she listened intently, memorizing the descriptions of the leaves. The next morning, she was up with the sun. She took a big portion of the leftover stew meat from the fridge, the good venison pieces, and wrapped it in a clean cloth. In her small backpack, she put her sketchbook, a bottle of water, and the hunting knife her grandfather had taught her to use only for plants. She told him she was going on a long sketching trip and would be careful. Her heart was a nervous drum in her chest as she climbed back up to the pine grove. What if he was gone? What if the infection had been too much? Or worse, what if he was waiting, angry and strong? She approached the spot with careful footsteps. For a long moment, she saw nothing. A crushing disappointment started to fill her. Then, a slight movement in the shadows of the granite boulder. He was there. He had moved just a little, into a patch of sun. He looked weaker. The wound looked angrier, red and swollen. She stopped a good distance away, even further than yesterday. She knelt down. "Hello again," she said softly. "I brought you something." She unwrapped the cloth, revealing the chunks of venison. The rich smell filled the air. The wolf's nose twitched. His ears, which had been flattened, twitched forward. A low whine escaped him, a sound of pure need battling with deep fear. He didn't move. The girl understood. Slowly, she took one piece of meat. She placed it on a clean, flat rock halfway between them. Then she scooted back to her original spot. She opened her sketchbook, pretending to be very interested in drawing a nearby fern. She watched from the corner of her eye dot. It took many minutes. The wolf stared at the meat. He stared at her. He was so hungry. The pain and fever were eating him from the inside. With a tremendous effort, he pushed himself up. He wobbled, legs shaky. He took one hesitant step, then two. He stretched his neck out as far as he could, his body tense, ready to flee. He snatched the meat from the rock and retreated in one quick, awkward motion, collapsing back into his spot. He swallowed it in one gulp. The girl let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She just waited. After a while, she placed another piece on the same rock and repeated her retreat. This time, he was a little quicker, a little less tense. She spent the morning that way, a silent exchange. Meat for trust. She never tried to get closer. When the meat was gone, she took out her water bottle, poured some into her cupped hand, and drank from it, showing him it was safe. Then she poured a small pool of water into a curled leaf and left it near the rock. "I have to go find some medicine for you," she told him, as if he could understand every word. "I'll be back." She spent the afternoon in the lower meadows, her grandfather's descriptions guiding her. She found the broad, hairy leaves of the comfrey plant. She found the feathery leaves and tiny white flowers of yarrow. She filled her cloth with them. The third day was cloudy and cool. When she arrived, the water in the leaf was gone. This was a good sign. Today, she had the plants and a small jar of warm water mixed with a little salt from the kitchen, the closest thing she could make to a cleaning solution. She did everything in slow motion. She chewed the comfrey and yarrow leaves into a sticky, green paste, just like her grandfather had described. It tasted bitter and earthy. She spat the paste into the cloth. "Your turn," she said gently. She dipped another corner of the cloth into the salt water. She crept forward, inch by inch. She was now closer than she had ever been. She could see the individual hairs of his fur, the flecks of brown in his golden eyes. His breathing was quick and shallow. He watched the cloth in her hand like it was a snake. "This will help," she whispered. "It will sting, but it will help." With a hand that trembled only a little, she reached out. She didn't touch him. She gently dabbed the wet cloth near the edge of the wound. The wolf flinched hard, a shudder running through his whole body. A warning rumble started in his chest. She pulled her hand back, waiting. The rumble faded. He was still there, but it took an hour. Dab, pause, wait. Let him settle. Each time, she got to clean a tiny bit more. The wound was clean now, the angry redness starting to look less fierce. Finally, she carefully placed the poultice of chewed leaves over it. He flinched at the new feeling, the coolness of it, but he didn't pull away. Exhausted, she sat back. The wolf laid his head down on his paws, his eyes heavy. He let out a long, slow sigh. It wasn't a sigh of pain. It was a sigh of relief. For the first time, He closed his eyes to sleep while she was still there. The little girl sat quietly, the quiet woods around them, and she knew the wall between them had cracked. He wasn't just a wild animal anymore. He was a patient. And she was no longer just a scared girl. She was a friend. The days began to turn with a new rhythm. The little girl would finish her chores for her grandfather, pack her small bag, and make the now familiar climb up to the high pine grove. It was no longer a trip filled with nervous fear, but with a quiet purpose. She was keeping a promise. The wolf's recovery was slow, but steady. The angry redness around the wound faded, replaced by clean, pink skin that was starting to knit itself back together. He could put more weight on his leg, and the dangerous fog of infection had cleared from his eyes. But something else was changing too. The sharp, untouchable wildness in him was softening around the edges, but only for her. She started calling him Silas. She'd read the name in one of her grandfather's old storybooks. It sounded strong and quiet, like him. She never said it out loud near the cabin, but up in their meadow, she would use it. "Good morning, Silas," she'd whisper as she arrived. He would rise from his resting spot, his movements more fluid each day, and give a slow, deliberate wag of his tail. It wasn't the frantic wag of a dog. It was more like a flag being gently raised, just for her. Their routine was simple. She would sit with her back against the sun-warmed granite boulder, and he would lie a few arms' lengths away, always watching the woods, always on guard. But his ears, which once swiveled constantly for every threat, would now often turn toward the sound of her voice. The girl talked. She talked more than she had in months. The words, all the feelings stuck inside her since her mother's death, found a way out in that quiet meadow. She told Silas about her mom, how she used to sing while making pancakes, how her laugh sounded like bells. She told him about the hollow ache in her chest that wouldn't go away. The wolf listened, his golden eyes steady on her. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the sadness, the remembering. She told him about her grandfather's funny stories, about the grumpy man who ran the general store, about her sketches. She would open her book and show him the drawings. "See, this is the woodpecker from yesterday. And this," she said, turning a page, "is you." It was a rough drawing, but she'd captured the proud slope of his head and the intensity in his eyes. He sniffed at the paper curiously when she held it out, then huffed a warm breath that made her smile. Sometimes she brought simple things to show him. A shiny, striped rock from the creek. A perfect white turkey feather. She would lay them on the ground between them. He would get up, limp over, and sniff them thoroughly, his nose twitching. Once he nudged the feather with his nose, sending it spiraling into the air. The girl laughed, a clear, bright sound that echoed in the space. The wolf's ears pricked forward at the unfamiliar noise, and he tilted his head as if trying to understand it. One afternoon, a week after she first found him, she brought a small, red apple from her grandfather's tree. She took a bite, crunching loudly. Silas watched, fascinated. She rolled the apple toward him. He approached it cautiously, then picked it up gently in his powerful jaws. He crunched it experimentally. The sweet, sharp taste was clearly a surprise. He ate the whole thing, core and all, and then looked back at her, almost as if to ask for another. This was their world, a world of silent understandings and small shared moments. He began to anticipate her arrival. Sometimes she would find him already waiting at the edge of the clearing. He started to lead her to other places, a hidden spring where the water was icy cold and sweet, a patch of wild strawberries bursting with flavor. He was sharing his territory with her. The greatest sign of trust a wild creature can give. Down in the cabin, her grandfather noticed a change. The quiet, sad shadow that had followed his granddaughter was beginning to lift. She hummed while washing dishes. Her smile came easier, reaching her eyes. She asked questions about the woods with a new, eager light in her face. "You've found a good friend out there in those trees, haven't you?" he asked one evening, looking up from mending a fishing net. The girl felt a flutter of panic. I like the quiet," she said, looking down at her hands. Her grandfather just nodded slowly, a wise smile on his lips. "The quiet can be a powerful healer. And so can good company of any kind." He didn't press further. He saw the life coming back to her, and that was all that mattered to him. He had no idea that her good company was the legendary ghost of the mountains, the creature he himself had warned her about. One day, a cold rain began to fall halfway through her visit. The girl shivered, huddling in her thin jacket. Silas stood up. He walked over to her, closer than he had ever come while she was sitting. He turned and settled himself on the ground right beside her, his broad, furry back acting as a shield against the wind and the worst of the rain. She could feel the warmth radiating from him. She held her breath, afraid to move. Slowly, carefully, she leaned back just a little until her shoulder was resting against the solid wall of his fur. He didn't flinch. He simply laid his head on his paws, watching the rain fall, sitting there, warm and sheltered next to the great wolf. The girl felt a peace she hadn't known since her mother was alive. The loneliness inside her had been met with another loneliness, and together they had made something different. Something like family. She knew this couldn't last forever. The world outside their meadow was real. But for now, in the soft patter of the rain, with Silas by her side, she felt truly, completely safe. Their bond was a secret thread woven into the fabric of the wild, invisible to everyone but them, and stronger than either of them could have imagined. The peace of the meadow couldn't last. The world outside, the world of people and noise and money, was always going to find its way in. It started with the distant, ugly cough of a truck engine, far down one of the old logging roads. Silas heard it first. His head snapped up from where he was resting, his ears becoming sharp points aimed at the valley below. A low growl, one the girl hadn't heard since the first day, vibrated deep in his chest. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "It's okay," she whispered, but her own voice sounded thin. The truck sound faded, but the quiet that followed felt wrong. A few days later, her grandfather sent her to the general store for flour and salt. The store was a dusty, warm place that smelled of leather and coffee. As she waited for the old man behind the counter to fill her sack, she heard the voices at the back, near the hunting supplies. "You see the size of that track?" "Near the West Ridge Creek," a man with a rough voice said. "That's no coyote. That's him." Another voice, sharper and more excited, chimed in. "Heard a guy from out of state is offering $5,000. Cash, for the pelt of that big lone wolf they call Ghost. Says it's for some lodge wall up north." The first man whistled. "5,000? That's a lot of reason to take a long walk in the woods." The girl's blood turned to ice. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The pelt. They wanted to turn Silas into a rug on some stranger's floor. The image filled her mind, horrible and sickening. "All set, kiddo?" the storekeeper said, pushing the sack toward her. She jumped, her heart hammering. She couldn't speak, just nodded, shoved some money across the counter, and fled. She ran most of the way home, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She didn't go to the meadow. She couldn't. Those men might already be out there. Instead, she went straight to her grandfather's big old map of the county, pinned to the wall of his study. Her eyes scanned the dense cluster of contour lines that marked the high mountains. There, on the far western edge, past the main ridges, was a place her grandfather had once called the Sanctuary. A high valley, circled by steep, rocky cliffs. It was hard to get to, and because of that, people almost never went there. It was all protected land, part of the national forest. That was it. That had to be the place. The next morning, the air felt different, tense. As she climbed the path, she saw a fresh boot print, large and deep, pressed into the mud near the deer trail. A cigarette butt, bright white against the brown pine needles. The smell of men and gun oil hung faintly in the air. Panic clawed at her throat. She found Silas pacing at the edge of their clearing. He was agitated, his movements stiff and anxious. He kept looking toward the south, his nose working the wind. When he saw her, he didn't wag his tail. He just stopped and stared at her, and in his eyes she saw a fear she recognized. It was the same fear she felt. He knew. "It's not safe here anymore," she said, her voice urgent. "We have to go. We have to go somewhere they won't look." She walked over to the granite boulder and pointed west toward the distant blue-hazed peaks. "There's a valley way out there. A safe place." He just watched her, panting slightly. How do you lead a wolf across miles of rugged wilderness? She had no rope, no leash. All she had was the fragile thread they had spun between them. She slung her backpack on, took a deep breath, and started walking out of the meadow, not on the path home, but on a faint animal trail heading west. She looked back. Silas didn't follow. He stood by the boulder, uncertain. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "You have to trust me." She took a few more steps and stopped again. This time, she crouched down, holding out her hand, just as she had on that first terrifying day. It was the ultimate test. To come to her, to touch her, while his whole wild being screamed at him to run, to hide, to be alone. For a long, agonizing moment, he stayed frozen. Then, with a grace that belied his size, he moved. He walked toward her, each step deliberate. He didn't stop at the usual distance. He came right up to her crouching form. He lowered his great head. She could feel his warm breath on her skin. And then he pressed the broad, smooth crown of his head firmly into the palm of her waiting hand. A tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. It wasn't sadness. It was the overwhelming feeling of a trust so complete it was terrifying. He was putting his life in her small hands. "Okay," she whispered, wiping her cheek. "Okay, let's go." Their journey was a silent, desperate partnership. She was the guide, using the sun and distant landmarks to keep them heading west. But he was the protector. His senses were their early warning system. Once, as she was about to step into a small, sunny clearing, his body suddenly blocked her path. A low, almost inaudible rumble warned her. Peering through the bushes, she saw the sleek, tan coat of a mountain lion draped over a high branch, watching. Silas stood his ground, his fur bristling, until the cat turned and vanished. He had steered her away from danger without a sound. They drank from icy streams. She shared her dried apples and jerky with him. At night, they huddled in a dense thicket of young spruce trees. He would lie curled around her, his body heat keeping the deepening cold at bay. She would fall asleep with her fingers buried in the thick fur of his neck, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Her legs ached, her feet were sore, and fear was a constant companion. But every time she looked back, Silas was there, his golden eyes patient and watchful. He was following her into the unknown, not because he had to, but because he believed in her. And that belief gave her a strength she never knew she had. They weren't just a girl and a wolf anymore. They were two refugees, fighting for one future, moving step by step toward the hope of a sanctuary. The second morning of their journey dawned clear and painfully cold. Frost coated the ferns and sparkled on the girl's backpack. Her breath came out in little white clouds. Every muscle in her body ached, a deep soreness from climbing and walking over terrain that was never meant for people. But she didn't complain. She just checked the map in her mind and looked at the line of jagged cliffs now much closer, their tops glowing pink in the sunrise. Silas seemed stronger. The long walk had stretched his healing leg, but it was holding. He moved with a new purpose, often trotting ahead to scout the path, then stopping to look back and make sure she was following. He was no longer just following. He was helping her find the way. The final climb was the hardest. It wasn't a path at all, just a steep, rocky scramble up a slope littered with loose stones. The girl used her hands, crawling on all fours at times, her small fingers clutching at roots and cracks in the stone. Silas bounded up ahead with an easy grace, then waited for her on a ledge, looking down with what seemed like concern. Finally, with one last heave, she pulled herself over a final lip of rock. She lay on her stomach for a second, breathing hard. Then she pushed herself up, and her eyes went wide. They were in the sanctuary. It was a bowl of pure, untouched beauty. A meadow of late-season wildflowers, gold and purple, swept down to a small, crystal-clear lake that mirrored the sky. Thick forests of pine and aspen climbed the sides, all the way up to the sheer rock walls that circled the entire valley like a protective fortress. The only sounds were the wind in the grass and the distant cry of a hawk. No truck sounds, no boot prints, no smell of men. It was a world apart. She stood up. Silas came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against her leg. Together, they looked at their new kingdom. She could see the tension slowly draining from his powerful body. His ears, which had been constantly swiveling for danger, relaxed. His head lifted, and he sniffed the clean, cold air. This was a place he understood. This was safety. They spent the afternoon exploring the edges of the meadow. She drank from the icy lake, the water so sweet it made her shiver. Silas vanished into the tree line and returned a while later, his muzzle wet. He'd found a spring. He'd hunted. This was his world now. As the sun began to sink, painting the cliff walls in fiery orange, the girl knew what she had to do. This wasn't her home. She had a grandfather who loved her, waiting in a warm cabin. Silas's home was here, in this wild, perfect place. Her heart felt like a heavy stone in her chest. She walked to a flat rock by the lakeshore and sat down. Silas followed and lay at her feet, resting his head on his paws. She looked at him, at the familiar scar on his flank, now just a silvery line, at the intelligent gold of his eyes that watched her face. "This is your place, Silas," she said, her voice thick. "You're safe here. The bad people can't find you here?" She reached out and buried her hand in the thick fur of his neck, feeling the solid strength underneath. He leaned into her touch, just as he had that first time in the rain. "I have to go home now," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a warm path down her cold cheek. "But I'll never forget you. Never." She stood up, her legs feeling weak. The wolf stood with her. She took a step back toward the rocky climb they had come up. He took a step forward. She shook her head, forcing a smile through her tears. "No, you have to stay. Be free." She said the last words like a gift. Be free. He had taught her about quiet strength. She hoped she had taught him that not all humans bring harm. He seemed to understand. He stopped following. He stood very still in the middle of that beautiful meadow, the last light of day turning his silver fur to molten gold. With the hardest courage she had ever had to find, the little girl turned and began to climb back down the rocky slope. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she saw him waiting, she might never leave. When she reached the bottom, now in deep shadow, she finally glanced up. Silhouetted against the darkening blue sky, on the very edge of the cliff, was a single, proud shape. He was watching her go. She lifted a hand in a small, silent wave. Then she turned and started the long walk home, alone in the gathering dark. Time passed. The story of the wolf called Ghost faded from town talk. The hunter from out of state got bored and left. The mountains kept their secret. The little girl grew. The sadness inside her never fully left, but it was joined by other things: a deep love for the wild places, a fierce need to protect them. She studied hard. Her room was filled with books on animals and ecosystems. She became a quiet young woman who spoke up loudly in science class about predators and balance. Years later, she stood on a high ridge as a wildlife biologist. Her binoculars trained on a new wolf pack that had moved into the area. Her colleagues chattered about tracking data and population studies. Then something caught her eye. Away from the pack, on an even higher outcrop of rock, Stu,